So we're breaking down the Declaration of Independence, and then we'll be looking at the Constitution. And so I have this book, and it's from Brent Allen Winters again. So there's Brent in the back. I don't think you can see him too well. Anyway, so we're going to start off with our Declaration lists the train of overt acts, abuses, and usurpations proving George's conspiracy with England's central bank money cartel and offshoot trading monopolies to replace common law courts and government with civil laws, international admiralty, and martial law, ruled by distant decree, searches without warrant, tribunals without due process, and criminal convictions without the jury. The same abuses and usurpations now afoot in the United States. So King George was running this place, the states, the colonies. He was running it under admiralty law and running it like he did any territory. And they saw the land and soil of England as being free soil, but that was because of William the Conqueror. Well, they didn't see their territories deserving the same kind of free soil, therefore common law privileges. Not a privilege, but a right. But so just have that kind of in your mind first, that even, the advocates for common law in England, like Blackstone, for example, didn't believe that the colonies deserved to have the free soil common law. So the people felt differently. So now the reason for our declaration is the king and his cronies' refusal to honor the common law in the British American colonies. The common law is the lifeblood and backbone of our declaration and constitution. These two documents, taken together, form the best brief of common law government ever penned and a solid foundation upon which to build a true understanding of freedom, possible only according to the course of the common law. So through the Declaration of Independence, nowhere does our declaration use the phrase of the word independence. So it's not in there. So in fact, to call this document the Declaration of Independence leaves the false impression that we have declared ourselves independent of everyone. And we have not. Instead, our declaration declares our shifting of three things. We're shifting our association, our loyalty, and our trust. And when you hear why, I think you'll like it. So first, we declared our shift of association from Britain, freedom of disassociation, which is very, it's part of common law. You can associate with, or you could choose to disassociate with. It's the right of association. So we don't want to associate with them anymore. So first, we declared our shift of association from Britain, freedom of disassociation, to associating as United States. And United is not capitalized. It's just lowercase united. So it is describing our states. A fellowship of succession from Britain's empire, joining forces in common defense. Second, we declared our shift of loyalty from Britain. These colonies are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, to the United States. So the signers stating for evidence that we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. So we make no pledge to the king. Third, we declared our shift of reliance upon Britain for protection to reliance upon the God of providence. The final paragraph declaring to whom we trust, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions and for support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. At bottom then, our declaration never declares our utter independence, but our shift of dependence for protection from British power to divine providence. Our declaration then goes further, giving the facts justifying our succession from Britain's empire. In a word, king and parliament, through bureaucrats using dominating devices of civil law, admiralty, administrative courts, canon, martial law, they were keeping or scheming to keep British American colonists from enjoying their common law freedoms. And so the colonists knew that England called her land free soil. And because the common law applied to anyone whose foot touched it, in fact, Magna Carta's phrase, law of the land, meaning common law, due process, was so called because it, they said, was innate only to the soil or land of their British island. So England, however, never deemed the soil of the colonies as blessed, and they only had it because of William the Conqueror. The first and last paragraphs of our declaration together follow Isaiah 33:22, acknowledging God to be the spring and holder of the three powers of government, legislator of his laws, the laws of nature and of nature's God, enforcer of his laws with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, and judge of his laws, the supreme judge of the world. Accepting the Godhead, both scripture and the common law tradition forbid that these three powers ever be gathered into the hands of any single will or mere men. So it's okay for God to have all three legislative powers. It's okay for him. He is the creator of heaven and earth. He is love. But for a man to have that power, it will be corrupted. It will be used to abuse the people. And we've seen it. So true rights are an individual matter. Even freedom of association to associate or disassociate with a group of others is an individual right. So in sum, our founders sought independency from men and dependency upon God, that they each would be free to choose and obey the duties of conscience and that their freedoms demanded. So now we're gonna go more into the Declaration. The first sentence of our Declaration relies for authority upon the God of nature's laws and the necessity of a people to separate themselves from control of distant rulers, while acknowledging that grounds for such separation must be facts, reasonable, open to the world, and explained. Our Declaration opens, as it also closes, with reliance on God. I'm going to read the very first section of the Declaration of Independence, and then we're going to break it down. We're going to break it down. I'm sorry. I've been reading a lot. So when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So we're separating ourselves, and we should tell the world and give them reasons why we're separating and we choose not to associate anymore with the king and to be under the imperial crown as a British territory. That's essentially what that's saying. So the first sentence of our declaration relies for authority upon the God of nature's laws and the necessity of a people to separate themselves from the control of distant rulers. And we want to be reasonable, we want to be open to the world, and we want to explain. And we close with our reliance on God. So that's the first section. And then the author comments, he says, our declaration's phrase, law of nature and of nature's God, speaks to natural law as a sense common to all, as opposed to Rome's civil canon law notions of natural law. So we all have the knack to discern right from wrong, and we can learn it, essentially. And the phrase natural law signifies standards of conduct inherent in any given relationship among men and women. Natural law is the inborn knack to sense right from wrong that sleeps in every person until threat of harm, righteous outrage, or a passion for kindness arouses it. And we all have the faculties to learn them. It doesn't mean that all people inherently from birth know right from wrong. It means you have the capacity to learn right from wrong. And we learn from each other too. Kids learn by watching each other, and they see somebody get in trouble for slapping someone else, and then they're like, okay, duly noted, not going to do that. And in short, natural law depends upon facts from nature. Nature depends upon nature's God. Natural law is so called also because its discovery depends upon nature in two respects. One discovers nature's facts by digging and looking, then by using one's natural ability to reason based upon facts dug from nature's mountain, one comes to conclusions, meaning you discover these things, you learn them, you learn right from wrong, especially by interacting with people. Because God, using nature, has written the sense of right and wrong in our hearts, it is inborn. Every man, therefore, stands responsible before God to use his natural ability to discern right from wrong. And I mean, you might have, just some born sociopaths that don't know right from wrong. They are disconnected. Anna has spoken about that, where, some people, from birth are born disconnected. And so maybe they don't. And that's kind of when society imposes consequences on them. So to sum up, men loosely call the individual's natural ability to set forth in Romans 2:14 through 15 natural law. To be sure, the laws of nature are natural. These verses, however, stress that each individual's ability to discern the law case by case is also natural. So this is Paul, I believe, speaking to the Romans. He wrote all his letters. And so Paul said specifically, for when the nations, having not a law, by nature from time to time do the things contained in the law, these not having a law are a law for themselves. So people doing the right thing when there's not a law written, pushing them to do it. They're naturally doing what's right. Proving that law's imprint is written in their yearning, their conscience, testifying with their desires. Also, between one another, they have thoughts of legal accusations and legal defenses. So when you get caught doing something wrong, you immediately want to come up with a defense of you're trying to establish why it's okay, why you did what you did. So pretty interesting. And now we're going to be moving on to the second phrase. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he goes in and he breaks it down, although it seems pretty obvious. I'll just pick out one thing. For instance, the signers here recognize their God's right over man's property and man's rights, because God is the creator of not only of man, but also of all things, both seen and unseen. And a man's responsibility to exercise these rights of duty back to him. The signers all knew and respected Scripture's teaching that the creator is the sole author and giver of man's life, Genesis 2:7, and liberty, Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. 1 through 2, and that he has clothed man with his authority over the earth and all other creatures, Genesis 1:28 and 9:2. So they're using biblical scripture to show that the creator is the only thing above man. All right, the next part, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their happiness, safety and happiness. So when we unpack that a little bit, the first thing that he talks about is just powers. Just powers are those powers of government to which the government we've consented, and we have given the government those powers. Thus, government's exercise of just powers is by the people's authority. What we've seen are unjust powers being used, which is a usurpation. So government without consent of the governed, a common law phrase of ancient use, they're exercising authority that we never gave them, that they don't have. And then the next part that we go to, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So when he comments about this, this clause asserts no right of revolution. Like, the founding fathers didn't say that we have a right to revolt and have a revolution. They're basically saying that men have unalienable rights, and when a government violates these rights, the people have the right to alter or abolish that government, remove people. So such rights, however, do not necessarily demand a violent overthrow. So Our declaration is no revolutionary manifesto. In fact, neither the word revolution nor language hinting at a call of arms is found in it. To be sure, full-blown war was not by the colonists' aggression. The British forced the war. So Britain removed any requirement when the colonies were still engaged under British Admiralty law. Britain removed any requirement for a search warrant and denied trial by jury. Consequently, they were breaking and entering homes and businesses, and they were seizing people's personal belongings and property, and to arrest those offensive to the central bank's monopolies. They were working with a banking cartel, and so that's what was happening to the British Americans at that time. But the Admiralty courts, being civil law tribunals and not common law courts, offered no real opportunity to correct government wrongs. So you see the British King George working with his banking cartel cronies, and they're abusing the British Americans. So of course, they're angry. And the Americans really followed the work of John Locke, and John Locke studied scripture, and he was educated in a Puritan outlook by John Owen. And so he never advocated for outright rebellion or revolution. And so when you look at how the Puritans fought in England, they were upset because the king was taking on the role of God, and they didn't like it. And so essentially, the Americans were doing the same thing. So he says, on the contrary, the British Parliament's 17th century war against the king and the British Americans' 18th century war against the king and Parliament followed humble but firm requests, later becoming a demand. So that's essentially what our declaration was demanding, but it wasn't aggressive. And so, remain with God's constitution of authority as common law requires, the English insisted that the British kings stop claiming rights of power that belonged to God. And so later on, the British Americans insisted that the king and Parliament stop usurping the same powers of God. So moreover, these English and American wars against imperial power were both in response against, not extensions of the Papal's revolution of civil law. So here you have the church after the Reformation, they're Protestant, and the British imperial crown is a crown of the Pope. And so he's imposing his civil law on the British Americans. And now we are going to hit another section. So the next section is, it continues, this is the Declaration of Independence. We're on the next section. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So what is this saying? It's saying four things. So one, there's a long train of abuses. Like you have a government that's not just doing one or two things, but there are quite a few things and usurpations and abuses that are happening to the people that would cause the people to throw off such a government. This long train is headed towards absolute despotism. It doesn't seem to be wandering from its path to despotism. And this train is showing a design to reduce the people under absolute despotism. It's what we have been seeing here. And you grow up in this country and you wonder what's wrong. And when you don't know everything, you just don't know how things can be so messed up in Washington, D.C. and how things can be so corrupt. But then when you realize it's just a corporation providing you services and it's not actually your government, then it becomes obvious, that they're not working in your best interests and they have a bottom line and they serve a principle, and that principle is not their priority creditors, it's something other. And so again, it's the same thing that our founding fathers were fighting against, that we are now under because we have a corporation for a government. So now we're going to be headed to the next section. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So when they say absolute tyranny or absolute despotism, it means enslavement. So when we go down a little bit further, looking through the comments of the author, it says, for 166 years before our declaration, Parliament had left her American colonies alone. King George the First was German. He became king when he was 50 years old, and he didn't, mess with the American colonists. They were left to their own. King George the Second pretty much left them alone. He was called a woman chaser, and he was busy accumulating debt with the French and Indian War. And it says, because during the 17th century, Parliament was forever occupied with trying to keep the crown from overreaching its common law limits back in England. Contention gathered, growing into a full-pitched war, ending with Parliament's victory and resulting in mass British migrations to Great Britain's land claims in America. So during all this, Parliament and its king paid little mind to the American colonies. Accordingly, the colonies grew audacious and prospered. However, the British Americans' freewheeling and intrepid ways and manners frightened Britain's German king, George III. So, in addition, Europe's bankers, exploiting the fears following England's 16th century internal war, had set up their central bank in England. King George was one of its chief beneficiaries, and consequently, he persuaded the then split Parliament, albeit according to his German, not English sensibilities, competing for his loyalty, to help him gain control over the colonies. So George misunderstood that common law is intolerant of monopolies, demanding that government never interfere with or chill common law's freedoms of association, which includes freedom to disassociate and to associate by contract, the law of promises, the freedom of choice of currency. In short, George blundered. Europe's central bank shareholders lost the American colonies with their monopoly of banking and trade in those colonies. Just too much imposition. So back to the Declaration, he has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. So unlike common law government, civil law is imperial and from a central command with bureaucrats forcing their will. Thus, it spurns local representative bodies. Our Declaration decries the king's decree from afar, denying the right to local legislative representation, including the legislative right to set up common law courts with trial by jury. Placing himself above personal rights, King George violated common law rights. And that's what so many people were truly upset about. And so back to George in the Declaration, he has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and then so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. So the people are asking the governors for things. The governors are being told that they have to ask King George, and then King George doesn't pay attention to them or answer the questions or, get back to them. So he's not doing his duty. For the reasons our declaration here states, our Constitution includes the 10-day rule and pocket veto. Consequently, the executive branch ignores Congress and its proposed legislation at peril of his power. If he fails to veto legislation sent to him for a signature, after 10 days it becomes law. Our declaration cites here a first principle of common law, the one having a responsibility to exercise discretion, the just power to say yes or no, and must do so. To ignore this duty is to trample upon the individual rights of the people. So the next section, it's with this fifth section of the Declaration. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So basically, he refused whole territories of Americans the common law's protection, including courts and trial by jury, unless they would pay all his taxes and they had their right of representation in the House of Commons taken away. And so he's basically holding new territories hostage until the inhabitants of those new territories, gave up rights. And so the British, the American Brits that were here, the colonists, they were British at heart, and their mindset was fixed in the tradition of centuries of growing up with Anglo-Saxon customs. And they knew that their king was duty bound to appoint judges and sheriffs, meaning county agents and bailiffs, to summon jurors. And in short, the king was to put in place the machinery of the common law courts and to let it run. And he wasn't doing it, and the people wanted it. And instead, he was working with his banking cronies to actually create monopolies and just impose despotism on the people. And so now we move on to the next section. Okay, the next section on King George III. He has called together legislative bodies at unusual places, uncomfortable and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. So just making things inaccessible, using distant courts and legislators that are inaccessible, just making everything hard on the people. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Here, our declaration again charges the king with ignoring common law separation of powers by interfering. So there's supposed to be a separation of powers. The king isn't supposed to mess with the legislature, and he is. And the people are unhappy with this. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. So what do they mean by that? At common law, among the foremost legislative powers are taxation, common defense, and the coining of currency. And here our declaration charges the king not with destroying the legislative powers and utterly impossibility, because the creator has given it to the people and inextricably bound it upon with the image of God in each person, but with keeping those powers at the unorganized militia level, and by force keeping the people, the unorganized militia, from organizing under the legislature's regulation, all for the common defense. Rulers that bar the people from choosing officers and organizing themselves into an armed militia to protect their families, their neighbors, their property, and their country, force the people to trust rulers for their defense. Such rulers history calls tyrants, and so does this declaration. So the people want the right to form their militias and to protect their people and their assets. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. So what they're saying here is that the civil law-minded government of King George would not officially permit entry into uninhabited land without the means to dominate the people that were entering that land. And that had not been the land law that the people were used to back on free soil England. And then the author goes into the fact that the word territory comes from the civil law tradition, because wherever Rome went, Rome extended its terror. So therefore territory. And it would terrorize the inhabitants. civil law government dominates and controls through terrorism, the inciting of fear of others or of that government itself. So then we'll go on to the next section. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. So, I mean, that seems pretty self-explanatory, but here our declaration charges the king with violating common law's separation of powers requirement by stopping the establishment of judiciary powers. He meant to displace the power of the common law courts to interpret the law with his will. And it's so unfortunate. More to the point, by disallowing courts, he does away with the jury, thereby putting all litigants at his mercy in his admiralty tribunals, and they're not being judged by their neighbors and peers. And then the next section, he has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salary. Again, the judges should be arising from the people, and they should not be afraid of losing their position because they're not upholding, what the king wants. They should be following the common law. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass people, and they're like parasites on the people. So we'll break it down a little bit more. Civil law-minded government inserts layers of bureaucrats, and we've seen that, with their administrative law between you and the jury as a tangled matting of brambles. These not only keep you from trial by jury, but also from a fair and impartial hearing before a neutral judge. Administrative courts, being of the civil law, has no jury, and their judges are kept men. They're dependent upon holding their jobs, and they are paid at the pleasure, of the government. The common law tradition is intolerant of professional bureaucrats, law enforcement agents, and prosecutors, which are all part of the parcel of the civil law tradition, the enemy and antagonist of common law. In fact, professional prosecutors and armed police were never part of the British American colonists' world. In England's professional prosecutors are still scarce. Until recent times, London's bobbies remained unarmed. In New England, armed police were uncommon until at least 1825. Simply put, the colonials' common law way of life distrusted government police with guns, requiring instead that the people arm themselves. Administrative law, a form of civil law, had spread from Babylon to ancient cities. Reaching from the Vatican during the 11th century, it infected all of Europe like a cancer, spawning bureaucrats and administrative codes. Appearing under many labels, it reached a zenith in revolutionary France, putting the will of the rulers for true law. It keeps the one wronged from his day before the jury. Reads and statutes. All right, I think we'll take a break there, and the next one will be the second video, and then we'll be able to finish breaking down the Constitution.